Hello, sleep seekers. I want to make one thing clear. I am not advocating Zen Buddhism. I am not trying to convert anyone to it. I have nothing to sell. I'm an entertainer. I just want you to enjoy a point of view that I also enjoy. Alan Watts. Tonight, we're talking about a fascinating character, a man who introduced millions of Westerners to Eastern philosophy, who made Zen accessible to people who would never sit in a meditation hall, who wrote prolifically and spoke beautifully about non-attachment, while being rather spectacularly attached to wine, women, and the sound of his own voice. Alan Watts was brilliant, contradictory, sincere, possibly fraudulent, deeply insightful, occasionally shallow, and above all, endlessly entertaining, which is perhaps what he actually was. An entertainer who happened to discuss enlightenment rather than an enlightened person who happened to entertain. The quiet hum of a reel-to-reel tape recorder captures his voice in a small studio, circa 1960-something. The slight hiss of analog recording creating warmth that digital can't quite replicate. His English accent cultivated, precise, with that particular mid-Atlantic quality that comes from being British, but spending decades in America, fills the room as he discusses the nature of reality, the illusion of the ego. He pauses occasionally to sip something from a glass that may or may not be just water, though by the later recordings it's probably not just water, probably contains something that helps him maintain the flowing eloquence, the apparent spontaneity that actually comes from years of practice, talking about these ideas in slightly different configurations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin at the beginning, which in this case means England, 1915, the middle of World War I, a time when discussing Eastern mysticism was considerably less fashionable than it would become 50 years later, when Alan made it his entire career. The English boy who loved Asian things. Alan Wilson Watts was born on the 6th of January 1915 in Chislehurst, a village in Kent, England, to middle-class parents who were probably quite ordinary but had the misfortune or fortune, depending on perspective, of producing a son who would spend his entire life being decidedly unordinary, or at least committed to appearing unordinary, which might amount to the same thing. His father, Lawrence Wilson Watts, worked for the Michelin tire company, which seems like a perfectly respectable occupation for an Englishman in the early 20th century. The sort of steady employment that provides comfortable middle-class existence without particular excitement or drama. His mother, Emily Mary Watts, was apparently more interested in artistic and spiritual matters, inadvertently planting seeds that would grow into his lifelong fascination with spiritual questions, though probably not in the Christian direction she intended. As a child, Alan was drawn to Asian art and culture in ways that seem unusual for an English boy. He collected Asian artifacts, studied Chinese and Japanese aesthetics, became fascinated with Buddhism and Taoism long before these traditions were widely known or discussed in the West. Where this interest came from is somewhat mysterious. There was a family friend, Francis Croshaw, who had connections to Buddhist circles and apparently encouraged young Alan's interests. But the intensity of Alan's fascination seems to have been his own, something intrinsic, rather than merely influenced by his environment. He attended King's School, Canterbury, one of those venerable English institutions that educates the sons of middle-class families who aspire to upper middle-class respectability. He was apparently a decent student, good at languages and humanities, less interested in mathematics and sciences, displaying early the pattern that would characterize his adult intellectual life. Brilliant at discussing ideas, less concerned with empirical verification or systematic rigor. By his teenage years, Alan was already writing about Buddhism, already positioning himself as interpreter between traditions. Despite having no direct experience of these traditions beyond reading books and looking at art. He was 16 when he became secretary of the London Buddhist Lodge, 17 when he began contributing articles to the journal Buddhism in England, 19 when he published his first book, The Spirit of Zen. Suzuki's work, without adding tremendous original insight, was essentially theorizing about something he'd read about rather than experienced. This pattern, talking eloquently about practices he didn't consistently practice himself, would continue throughout his life, creating tension between his role as teacher and his actual relationship to the teachings. Still with young Alan in England, not yet the famous philosopher-entertainer, but a precocious teenager with unusual interests and considerable verbal facility. In 1936, at age 21, Alan met Eleanor Everett, an American woman whose mother, Ruth Fuller Everett, was deeply involved in bringing Zen Buddhism to America, had studied in Japan, knew important Zen teachers, moved in circles of people taking Buddhism seriously rather than as intellectual curiosity. Eleanor and Alan married in 1938, which was convenient for Alan's career prospects, as marrying into a family connected to actual Zen practitioners gave him legitimacy and access he wouldn't have had otherwise. Whether Alan married Eleanor primarily for love or partly for these connections is the sort of question biographers speculate about, but can never definitively answer, as human motivations are typically mixed, unclear even to the people experiencing them. Let's be generous and assume both love and opportunism were present simultaneously, as they often are in relationships that also serve practical purposes. Shortly after marrying, Alan and Eleanor moved to America. This was 1938. Europe heading toward war, America seemingly safer and offering opportunities that England couldn't. Alan was 23, had published one book, had enthusiasm and eloquence, but no formal credentials, no systematic training, no clear career path, except a vague sense that he could make something of this interest in Eastern philosophy, if only he could find the right context, the right audience, the right way to present these ideas to Western seekers. The unlikely Anglican priest. What Alan did next seems, in retrospect, this is essentially Anglican Christianity, the American branch of the Church of England, decidedly not Buddhism or Taoism or any of the Eastern traditions Alan supposedly cared about. Why would someone fascinated with Zen Buddhism, who had already written about Eastern philosophy? The reasons were partly practical. Practically, becoming a priest provided stable employment, social position, a clear role in American society that, freelance philosopher of Eastern thought, did not provide in 1938 America, where Buddhism was exotic, suspicious. The priesthood offered a legitimate platform for discussing spiritual matters, even if those spiritual matters had to be framed in Christian terms. Theologically, Alan convinced himself or claimed to convince himself that Christianity and Eastern philosophy weren't contradictory but complementary, that Christian mysticism and Zen pointed towards similar truths despite different cultural expressions, that he could serve as bridge between traditions, bringing Eastern insights into Christian context. This is either genuine syncretism or elaborate rationalization for doing what was practically convenient. Allen enrolled at Seabury Western Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, studying theology, learning liturgy, preparing for ordination. He apparently did well academically, was eloquent in discussions, could present Christian theology articulately and persuasively, even if his personal beliefs were somewhat more complicated than Orthodox Christianity typically allows. He was ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1945, assigned to Canterbury House, the Episcopal chaplaincy at Northwestern University, where he served students, conducted services, taught classes, and presumably struggled with the tension between his role as Christian minister and his actual theological convictions, which by this point were decidedly more Buddhist than Christian, more mystical than doctrinal, more interested in direct experience than faith in external authority. During these years, Allen and Eleanor had a daughter, Joan, born in 1942. They would eventually have more children, 7 total across Allen's various marriages. And Allen's relationship with his children would be complicated, characterized by affection when present, but frequent absence. His attention focused on his work, his ideas, which seems unfortunate, but entirely consistent with the mid-20th century pattern of fathers prioritizing career over family involvement. Allen continued writing and speaking about Eastern philosophy even while serving as Christian priest, creating some cognitive dissonance both for himself and for people who knew him. He published Behold the Spirit in 1947, attempting to present Christian theology in terms influenced by Eastern thought, trying to build that bridge he'd imagined. Though the book was neither orthodox enough to satisfy traditional Christians, nor Eastern enough to satisfy people wanting actual Asian philosophy, falling awkwardly between traditions rather than successfully synthesizing them. By the late 1942, Allen was increasingly uncomfortable in his role as priest, increasingly wanting to teach Eastern philosophy directly, rather than filtering it through Christian framework. His marriage to Eleanor was also deteriorating. They had grown apart, wanted different things, had perhaps never been particularly compatible beyond initial attraction, and shared interest in Buddhism. In 1950, Allen made a decisive break. He left the priesthood, divorced Eleanor, resigned from any pretense of being Christian minister, and committed fully to making his living as philosopher, writer, and speaker on Eastern thought. This required considerable courage or considerable recklessness. No clear plan except believing he could support himself through writing and lectures, which was optimistic, given that Eastern philosophy was still quite niche in 1950 America. Not yet the cultural phenomenon it would become in the 1960 seconds. He moved to California, which would become his permanent home. Live the life that would make him famous or infamous depending on who you asked. California in 1950 was already becoming the center of American spiritual experimentation, the place where new ideas and alternative lifestyles found more acceptance than in conservative Midwest or traditional East Coast. Perfect environment for someone wanting to make career discussing Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Hindu Vedanta to audiences willing to listen. He also remarried quickly to Dorothy DeWitt in 1950, just months after his divorce from Eleanor finalized. Dorothy was younger, more free-spirited, more aligned with Alan's emerging lifestyle, less concerned with respectability or conventional morality. They would have 5 children together over the next several years, creating a large household that Alan supported through his writing, speaking, and eventually radio broadcasts. Managing financially, but never comfortably. Always needing the next book advance, the next lecture series, the next source of income to maintain the family. The somewhat conventional academic figure, to Alan Watts the cultural phenomenon, though the phenomenon hadn't quite emerged yet, was still being formed, still finding its voice and its audience, still working out how to present Eastern philosophy in ways that were accessible, entertaining, and commercially viable, which would turn out to be Alan's particular genius. His ability to make ancient wisdom sound relevant and exciting to modern Westerners who knew nothing about it. California was becoming something different from the rest of America, more open to experimentation, more willing to question conventional values, more receptive to ideas from Asia, from indigenous cultures, from anywhere that wasn't the mainstream Protestant Christianity and consumer capitalism that dominated post-war American culture. San Francisco particularly, with its bohemian traditions, its port connecting to Asia, its history of tolerance for eccentricity, became the perfect home for Alan's particular project of translating Eastern wisdom for Western seekers. Alan settled in the Bay Area, initially living in various places, before eventually moving to a houseboat in Sausalito in 1957, which would become iconic, the houseboat representing his lifestyle floating, slightly unconventional, connected to but separate from mainland society, literally living on the margins. The houseboat was small, somewhat ramshackle, but it was also beautiful, offering views of the bay, of San Francisco across the water, of boats passing, of light changing on the water's surface, providing aesthetic richness that compensated for practical inconveniences. He began giving lectures wherever people would listen. Small gatherings, where word of mouth brought audiences curious about this Englishman, who could explain Buddhism and Taoism in clear, entertaining language without requiring years of study or uncomfortable meditation postures. Alan discovered he was extraordinarily good at this, at holding an audience's attention, at explaining complex ideas simply without oversimplifying them completely, at being funny and profound simultaneously, at making ancient philosophy feel immediately relevant to people's actual lives and concerns. In 1951, he published The Wisdom of Insecurity, which became his first significant commercial success. The book addressed post-war anxiety, the sense that despite material prosperity, Americans felt uncertain, fearful, lacking something essential. Alan argued that this insecurity came from trying to find security through money, status, relationships, beliefs, when security was ultimately impossible, that accepting insecurity, accepting impermanence, accepting that nothing lasts, was actually the path to peace, rather than trying to construct permanent stability in an impermanent world. This message resonated. He followed with The Way of Zen in 1957, The book explained Zen's history, its principles, its practices, in language that was accessible without being condescending, scholarly without being academic, capturing something essential about Zen, while inevitably simplifying and adapting it for readers who knew nothing about Buddhism, who had never meditated, who were approaching this material purely intellectually. Zen scholars and practitioners had mixed reactions to the way of Zen. Some appreciated Alan's ability to introduce Zen to Western audiences, to create interest that might lead people to actual practice. Others criticized his presentation as too intellectual, too divorced from actual Zen training, too focused on concepts, when Zen emphasizes direct experience beyond concepts. D.T. Suzuki, whose work had influenced Alan significantly, apparently thought Alan understood Zen intellectually, but hadn't realized it experientially, was talking about enlightenment rather than speaking from enlightenment, which is a subtle but significant distinction. Alan himself was somewhat aware of these criticisms and addressed them periodically. He never claimed to be a Zen master, never presented himself as enlightened, was relatively honest about his role as interpreter and entertainer, rather than realized teacher. That quote at the beginning, "I'm an entertainer," wasn't false modesty, but genuine acknowledgement that he was performing a different function than traditional Zen teachers, was creating what he sometimes called spiritual entertainment. Whether this spiritual entertainment had genuine value or was essentially Buddhism-flavored self-help, supporters argue Alan introduced millions of people to ideas that enriched their lives, that even intellectual understanding of Eastern philosophy is better than no understanding, that not everyone needs or wants rigorous meditation practice, that there's legitimate value in simply thinking about these perspectives. Critics argue he commodified ancient traditions, made them palatable by removing everything difficult and demanding, created impression that you could get Buddhism's benefits, peace, wisdom, freedom from suffering, without actually practicing, without changing your life, without the discipline and commitment that traditional practice requires. Both positions have merit. Create ongoing tension in how we evaluate Alan's legacy and influence. During the 1,950 seconds, Alan also began his radio career, which would become perhaps his most important medium. KPFA, a listener-supported radio station in Berkeley, gave him a weekly program where he could talk for extended periods about Eastern philosophy, speaking extemporaneously with minimal notes, his natural eloquence and years of lecturing allowing him to improvise coherent, engaging talks that listeners found compelling. These radio broadcasts reached audiences beyond those who would attend lectures, beyond those who would read his books, making Eastern philosophy available to anyone with a radio, democratizing access to ideas that had previously been limited to academic specialists or serious practitioners. The broadcasts were recorded on reel-to-reel tape, preserved, and would eventually be distributed widely, becoming perhaps Alan's most enduring legacy. You can still listen to these talks today. Hundreds of hours of Alan discussing consciousness, ego, time, nature, technology, religion, all filtered through his particular synthesis of Buddhism, Taoism, Vedanta, and Western philosophy. His voice is distinctive. The English accent, the precise articulation, the occasional chuckle when he says something amusing, the way he builds arguments methodically, anticipating objections, offering examples. He also began teaching at the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco. The academy was itself somewhat unconventional, more interested in Eastern philosophy and comparative religion than traditional academic subjects, attracting students who were seekers as much as scholars, who wanted wisdom rather than just credentials. Allen fit perfectly into this environment, could teach without the constraints of conventional academic departments, could explore ideas freely, could connect Eastern and Western thought without worrying about disciplinary boundaries or orthodox interpretations. His personal life during this period was, to put it diplomatically, complicated. His marriage to Dorothy produced children, but was strained by Allen's workload, his travel schedule, his drinking, and his affairs. Allen was not particularly monogamous, not particularly committed to conventional morality about relationships, rationalized his behavior through philosophy about non-attachment, about not being bound by social conventions. Whether these philosophical justifications were sincere or convenient, the drinking was becoming more noticeable. Allen had always enjoyed alcohol wine with meals, drinks at social gatherings, but by the late 1950s, his consumption was increasing, becoming less occasional indulgence and more daily habit, more crutch for managing anxiety, more necessary component of his social performance. He wasn't yet what would be called an alcoholic. Or perhaps he was, but it wasn't yet interfering significantly with his work, wasn't yet creating obvious problems, beyond occasional hangovers and increased tolerance, requiring more alcohol to achieve the same effects. Friends and colleagues noticed, but rarely confronted him directly. This was partly cultural 1950 seconds. America didn't discuss alcohol problems openly, preferred to ignore or minimize them, and partly because Allen was charming, functional, productive, despite the drinking. Still writing books, still giving brilliant lectures, still supporting his family. By 1960, Allen was established. He had found his niche, his voice, his audience. The 1960 seconds would bring even greater success and recognition as countercultural movements discovered Eastern philosophy, and Allen was perfectly positioned to serve as their guide, their interpreter, their eloquent spokesman for ancient wisdom applied to modern alienation and seeking. The counterculture guru. The 1960 seconds transformed American culture in ways that were perfect for Alan Watts's particular talents and message. Young people were questioning authority, rejecting conventional values, experimenting with drugs, seeking alternative spiritualities, looking for meaning beyond materialism and career success. Eastern philosophy, which had been niche interest in the 1950 seconds, became cultural phenomenon in the 1960 seconds, and Allen was positioned as the person who could explain it, who already had the books written, the lectures prepared, the radio broadcasts recorded. The Beat generation had already discovered Allen in the late 1950 seconds. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, and others read his books, attended his lectures, incorporated his ideas into their poetry and prose. When hippie counterculture emerged in the mid-1960 seconds, building on Beat foundations while expanding to broader youth movement, Allen's audience multiplied enormously. He became, somewhat uncomfortably, a guru figure. Young people came to his houseboat seeking wisdom, wanting him to tell them how to live, treating him as enlightened master despite his repeated disclaimers. Alan appreciated the attention and the income. His lectures could now command significant fees. His books sold widely. Publishers wanted more of his work, but was also aware that the adulation was somewhat absurd, that he wasn't actually the wise sage people imagined, was just someone who had read extensively and could talk well about what he'd read. The psychedelic movement particularly embraced Alan's ideas. LSD and other psychedelics were becoming widely used in countercultural circles, and people having intense psychedelic experiences read Buddhist and Taoist ideas in Alan's books that seemed to describe what they'd experienced: ego dissolution, unity consciousness, the illusory nature of separation, timelessness, ineffability of mystical states. Alan became interpreter of psychedelic experiences, helping people make sense of what they'd encountered, providing philosophical framework for integrating these experiences. Alan himself tried psychedelics, participated in early LSD research, wrote about his experiences in The Joyous Cosmology, published in 1962, describing psychedelic consciousness with his characteristic eloquence. He was generally positive about psychedelics, saw them as potentially useful tools for spiritual insight, while also cautioning that they weren't themselves enlightenment, were experiences that might point toward truth, but weren't the same as sustained realization. This position was more nuanced than what many of his young followers wanted to hear. They wanted confirmation that taking LSD was spiritual practice, was shortcut to enlightenment, was legitimate path rather than drug use. Alan tried to maintain distinction between temporary states and permanent transformation, but his nuance often got lost in counterculture enthusiasm for drugs as spiritual technology. His 1966 book, The Book, on the taboo against knowing who you are, became one of his most popular works, presenting his core teaching about the illusory nature of the separate self, about how we are not isolated egos but expressions of the universe, about how recognizing this dissolves anxiety and creates joy. The book was accessible, profound, funny. It sold widely, introduced his ideas to new generation, solidified his status as important countercultural voice. He lectured constantly during this period, traveling across America and internationally. His standard talk format involved speaking for about an hour without notes, developing themes extemporaneously, responding to the energy of the audience, occasionally telling jokes or personal stories, always circling back to core themes: the ego as illusion, the universe as unified field. These lectures were performances as much as teachings. Alan was theatrical, used his voice skillfully, varying pace, pitch, volume for emphasis, employed dramatic pauses, built to climaxes, created rhythm and flow that kept audiences engaged even when discussing abstract philosophy. He was genuinely entertaining, could make people laugh while discussing consciousness and mortality, combined profundity with levity in ways that made Eastern philosophy seem not just interesting, but fun, enjoyable, something you could engage with while drinking wine and having good conversations, rather than requiring grim asceticism and uncomfortable meditation postures. This entertainment quality was both his strength and the source of criticism. Traditional practitioners argued he was making Buddhism into performance, removing its power by making it comfortable, suggesting you could get its benefits without the difficult practice, the discipline, the fundamental reorientation of life that actual Buddhist training requires. Alan never quite answered this criticism satisfactorily. Perhaps because there was no good answer. Perhaps because he was in fact doing exactly what critics said, making Eastern philosophy into spiritual entertainment, which wasn't wrong, but wasn't the same as what traditional teachers did. By the late 1960s, Alan's alcohol consumption had progressed from social drinking to something more serious, more constant, more necessary. Wine with lunch, drinks in the afternoon, more wine with dinner, possibly more drinks after dinner. The pattern of someone using alcohol, not just for pleasure, but for management, for maintaining equilibrium, for dealing with anxiety or depression, or simply the weight of being Alan Watts, performing Alan Watts, maintaining the persona that audiences expected, friends noticed. But confronting him was difficult, because Alan was articulate, defensive, capable of philosophical justification for anything, including his drinking. He could argue that clinging to sobriety was itself attachment, that Zen masters drank sake, that Western Puritanism about alcohol was cultural conditioning rather than spiritual truth, that he was fine, functioning perfectly well. These arguments were sophistry, intellectual defense mechanisms, but they were sophisticated sophistry, and he was still productive, still writing books, still giving lectures, still supporting his family financially. Was just his personal choice, his way of managing a demanding life, his right as an adult who could make his own decisions about his body and habits. His second marriage to Dorothy had ended in divorce in 1964 after 14 years and 5 children. The relationship had been strained for years by Alan's affairs. His drinking, his frequent travel, his absorption in his work, and public persona to the exclusion of family life. Dorothy, apparently tired of being married to someone who was physically present but emotionally absent, who talked about loving kindness in lectures, but was often difficult and demanding at home. In 1964, the same year his divorce finalized, Alan married Mary Jane Yates King, called Jano. This was his third marriage, and Jano was considerably younger than Alan, part of the counterculture scene. They had an open marriage by agreement, which is to say Alan continued having affairs, and Jano accepted this as part of being with him, as part of his philosophy about not being bound by social conventions about monogamy and possession. Whether this arrangement was genuinely mutually agreed upon, or whether Jano simply accepted it because she loved him, and that was the only way to be with him, is difficult to determine from outside the relationship. Open marriages can work when both partners genuinely want them, but they can also be arrangements where one partner has more power and the other accommodates, because the alternative is losing the relationship entirely. Friends who knew them had different opinions about whether theirs was the former or the latter. The houseboat where they lived in Sausalito became something of a salon, a gathering place for intellectuals, artists, seekers, people from the counterculture who wanted to meet Alan, to sit and talk and drink wine. These gatherings were often brilliant, electric, with ideas and laughter, and the kind of conversation that only happens when intelligent people who've read widely come together without agenda beyond enjoying discourse. They were also sometimes messy, alcohol-fueled, extending late into the night, people staying over, boundaries getting blurred, the kind of bohemian lifestyle that looks romantic in retrospect, but was probably exhausting to maintain in practice. Alan wrote prolifically during this period, producing books almost annually. The Wisdom of Insecurity, 1951. The Way of Zen, 1957. Nature, Man and Woman, 1958. This Is It, 1960. The Joyous Cosmology, 1962. The Book, 1966. Does It Matter? 1970. Behold the Spirit, 1971. In My Own Way. His autobiography, 1972. And many others, over 25 books total across his career, plus countless essays and articles and recorded lectures. The quality varied. Some books contain genuine insight, clear thinking, useful perspectives on perennial questions about consciousness and meaning. Others feel repetitive, like variations on themes he'd already explored more deeply in earlier works, written perhaps more to fulfill contracts and maintain income than from burning need to express new ideas. This is not unusual for prolific writers. Not everything can be equally inspired, and the economic realities of supporting a family and maintaining a lifestyle require steady production regardless of inspiration. His autobiography, In My Own Way, published in 1972, provides fascinating window into how Alan understood himself and his life. He's remarkably honest about some things: his affairs, his drinking, his complicated relationships with his children. But he's also defensive, justifying, explaining why these contradictions aren't really contradictions, but expressions of a more sophisticated understanding that transcends conventional morality. Reading the autobiography creates odd sensation of simultaneous admiration and frustration. Here's someone brilliant and self-aware enough to see his own patterns and contradictions, instead constructing elaborate philosophical frameworks that make his behavior seem not just acceptable, but somehow more enlightened than conventional virtue. It's impressive and sad simultaneously. His relationship with his children was strained. He had 7 children across 3 marriages, loved them in his way, but was often absent traveling for lectures, absorbed in his work, living a lifestyle that didn't accommodate consistent parenting. His children have spoken about this in various interviews and memoirs, expressing mixed feelings: appreciation for his brilliance and his ideas, gratitude for the interesting life they experienced, but also pain about his absence, about feeling less important than his work, about the ways his philosophy of non-attachment manifested as emotional unavailability in practice. One of his daughters, Joan Watts, wrote about growing up with Alan, describing both the excitement of being Alan Watts's daughter, the interesting people, the conversations, the sense of being part of something culturally important, and the difficulty of having a father who was more interested in talking about enlightenment to audiences than in engaging with the mundane responsibilities of raising children. She loved him, clearly, but also recognized his limitations as father, the gap between his public persona and private reality. This gap between teaching and living, between the wisdom expressed in lectures and the messiness of actual life, is perhaps Alan's most significant characteristic. The thing that makes him human rather than hagiographic figure, the thing that both sympathizers and critics focus on when evaluating his legacy. Sympathizers argue that imperfect humans can still share valuable insights, that we shouldn't expect spiritual teachers to be perfect, that Alan's honesty about his limitations was itself a kind of teaching. Critics argue that if you can't embody what you teach, perhaps your teaching lacks something essential, perhaps intellectual understanding. Without transformation isn't actually wisdom, but sophisticated confusion. By the early 1970s, the constant travel was exhausting. The pressure to always be brilliant and entertaining in lectures was draining. The drinking was taking physical toll, and he was aware, though perhaps not fully admitting, that he had made a hash of his personal life. Despite understanding theoretically how to live wisely, he continued working because that's what he did. Because stopping would mean confronting questions about meaning and accomplishment that were easier to avoid through activity. Because his identity was so thoroughly bound up with being Alan Watts that retiring from that role would be a kind of death. The lectures from this period sometimes show the strain. His voice is still beautiful, his articulation still precise, but there's weariness underneath. Moments where he seems to be going through motions, delivering familiar material, because audiences expect it, rather than because he has new insight to share. The spontaneity and freshness of earlier talks sometimes gives way to routine, to polished performance that's perhaps too polished, too perfected, lacking the rough edges that make ideas feel alive and immediate rather than rehearsed. He was also drinking before some lectures, which friends and organizers noticed not drunk exactly, but loosened by alcohol, needing it to maintain the performance, to overcome whatever anxiety or discomfort or simple exhaustion drove him to the bottle. This didn't always diminish the lecture's quality. Sometimes, the alcohol seemed to free him, made him more spontaneous, more willing to take risks. But it created underlying unease among people who cared about him, who saw where this trajectory led, who wanted to intervene, but didn't know how. The final years and unexpected death. In 1973, Alan Watts was 58 years old, living on his houseboat in Sausalito, married to Jarno. Still lecturing, though less frequently. Still writing, though with less energy than before. He had developed heart problems, likely related to his drinking, to his lifestyle, to decades of stress and travel and performance. His doctors told him he needed to slow down, to stop drinking, to take better care of himself. Whether he followed this advice is doubtful. On the 16th of November 1973, the official cause was heart failure, though whether this was natural heart failure or complicated by decades of alcohol consumption is unclear from available records, and the distinction perhaps doesn't matter much. He died relatively young, 58, is not old, especially not by today's standards, but not unexpectedly young, given his lifestyle, his health issues, his refusal to moderate habits that were clearly damaging him. The death was sudden enough to be shocking despite these warning signs. People who knew him, who had seen him lecture recently, that the voice they'd heard so often would never speak again. That the personality that had filled rooms and radio broadcasts and conversations had ceased to exist, or at least ceased to exist in the particular form they'd known. His funeral was Buddhist in style, reflecting his lifelong engagement with Buddhism, even though he'd never formally converted. Friends spoke, students spoke, family members spoke, all attempting to capture something about who he had been, what he had meant, how his teaching had affected them. The eulogies were probably more unanimous in praise than Allen would have been in life, as funerals tend to emphasize positive aspects and minimize complications. But they reflected genuine appreciation for his contribution, genuine grief at his loss. The question of Allen's legacy began immediately and continues today. Over 50 years after his death, what did he actually accomplish? What was his real contribution? Was he profound teacher or clever entertainer? Did he help people or mislead them? The answers depend entirely on who you ask and what criteria they use for evaluation. His books remain in print. His recorded lectures are available online, have been sampled in music, are shared across social media, reach audiences he never could have imagined in his lifetime. His ideas have influenced countless people, some casually, some deeply shaping how Western culture thinks about consciousness, ego, nature, time, spirituality. He made Eastern philosophy accessible to millions who would never have encountered it otherwise, created vocabulary and frameworks that are now common currency in discussions about mindfulness and meditation and non-duality. This democratization of Eastern philosophy is either his great achievement or his great failure. Achievement, if you think making these ideas widely accessible, is valuable, regardless of depth of engagement. If you believe intellectual understanding has worth even without practice. If you value the conversation and perspective shift that Eastern philosophy can provide even to people who never meditate. Failure, if you think he commodified ancient wisdom, stripped it of anything challenging or transformative, gave people impression they could get Buddhism's benefits without Buddhism's demands, created spiritual consumerism, where people shop for ideas that make them feel good. Traditional Buddhist teachers and practitioners have mixed opinions about Allen's legacy. Some appreciate that he introduced their tradition to Western audiences, created interest that led some people to genuine practice, served as gateway figure, even if he wasn't himself realized teacher. Others resent how he presented Buddhism, gave people wrong impression about what Buddhism actually is. D.T. Suzuki, whose work influenced Allen significantly, reportedly said that Allen had a brilliant mind and could explain Zen very well intellectually, but his understanding was mainly philosophical rather than experiential. This is probably accurate assessment. Allen understood Zen ideas, could articulate them beautifully, but hadn't necessarily realized them in the way that serious practice produces, was speaking about enlightenment rather than from enlightenment. Allen himself seemed aware of this limitation and relatively honest about it. He never claimed to be enlightened, never presented himself as Zen master, was clear that he was philosopher and entertainer rather than guru. That quote at the beginning, "I'm an entertainer, I'm not advocating Zen Buddhism," wasn't false modesty, but genuine recognition of his role. The problem was that audiences often didn't take him at his word, wanted him to be more than entertainer, projected onto him the role of enlightened master despite his disclaimers. His influence on Western Buddhism is undeniable but complicated. But he also may have created misconceptions that serious practitioners spend years undoing the idea that you can understand Buddhism intellectually without practicing. That meditation is just relaxation technique rather than transformative discipline. That Eastern wisdom can be adopted. The spiritual but not religious movement that dominates contemporary American spirituality owes much to Alan's influence, to his presentation of wisdom traditions as philosophical perspectives, rather than religious commitments, as sources of insight, rather than systems requiring adherence. This has made spirituality more accessible to people alienated by organized religion, but has also created somewhat rootless seeking, people sampling from multiple traditions without committing to any, taking what's comfortable and ignoring what's challenging, which is exactly what critics accused Alan of doing and teaching others to do. But perhaps we've been too focused on contradictions, too concerned with measuring Alan against standards he never claimed to meet, too invested in the gap between his teaching and his living, when that gap itself. Because here's what Alan Watts actually did, what he actually accomplished in his 58 years. He took ancient wisdom that had been locked away in academic departments and monasteries, that had been presented to Westerners in dry scholarly translations, or in forms requiring complete cultural conversion, and he made it alive. He made it relevant. He made it speak to the actual concerns of modern people living in industrialized, alienated, anxious Western societies, who weren't going to become Buddhist monks, but who still sensed something was missing, who still asked fundamental questions about meaning and consciousness and how to live. His voice, that beautiful, precise, warm English voice, reached millions of people who had never heard anyone talk about consciousness the way he did. That the present moment might be all that exists, that the universe might be a unified field expressing itself through apparently separate forms. These ideas weren't originally Alan's, obviously. They came from Buddhism, Taoism, Vedanta. But Alan translated them, not just linguistically, but culturally, finding metaphors and examples and ways of explaining that made sense to modern Western minds. He compared the universe to an apple tree producing apples, saying that the universe peoples in the same way we aren't strangers in a mechanical cosmos, but natural expressions of it. Like waves are expressions of the ocean, not separate things riding on the ocean's surface. This simple metaphor helped countless people understand non-duality in ways that philosophical texts about emptiness and form never could. He explained the ego's illusory nature by comparing it to a mirage, to a knot that doesn't exist in the rope but is just rope twisted back on itself, to a character in a dream who doesn't realize it's part of the dreamer. These explanations weren't dumbed-down versions of Buddhist teaching. They were skillful means, upaya, adapting wisdom to the audience's capacity to understand, which is exactly what good teachers do. He made people laugh while discussing death and meaninglessness and the void, which is perhaps the most valuable thing anyone can do, helping people face difficult truths without being crushed by them, showing that profundity and humor aren't contradictory but complementary, that you can acknowledge life's fundamental groundlessness while still enjoying the dance, still appreciating the beauty, still finding joy in the play of existence. His radio broadcasts, those hundreds of hours of recorded talks, continue introducing people to these ideas decades after his death. A teenager in Nebraska can discover Alan Watts on YouTube. Perspectives that make sense of their intuitions, permission to question assumptions their culture presents as obvious truths. This is no small thing. This is genuine service, genuine teaching. And perhaps his imperfection, his very human struggles with alcohol and relationships, and embodying what he taught. Perhaps these aren't failures, but part of the teaching. Perhaps having a teacher who was obviously human, who never pretended to be perfect, who was honest about his limitations. Perhaps this is actually more helpful than having distant, seemingly perfect masters who you can never imagine being like. Alan showed that you can have profound insights without being transformed into a saint, that understanding truth intellectually is valuable, even if you can't fully embody it, that the journey matters, even if you never arrive at some final destination of complete enlightenment. He demonstrated that spiritual life isn't about perfection, but about engagement, about asking questions, about maintaining sense of wonder and curiosity about existence. Even especially when you can't live up to your own ideals. His willingness to admit, "I'm an entertainer." He could have claimed more, could have let people make him into a guru, could have accepted the projections of enlightenment that followers wanted to place on him. Instead, he kept pointing back to the actual traditions, kept saying he was just explaining ideas from Buddhism and Taoism, kept refusing the role of enlightened master, even when accepting it would have been financially and egotistically rewarding. The fact that he made Eastern philosophy entertaining isn't corruption of ancient wisdom, it's skillful adaptation to modern context. People in 1960 seconds America weren't going to read the Lankavatara Sutra in the original Sanskrit. They weren't going to spend years in Zen monasteries sitting in meditation. But they might read Alan's books, might listen to his radio broadcasts, might attend his lectures, and through these encounters, might discover perspectives that genuinely helped them, genuinely changed how they experienced life, genuinely reduced suffering, and increased appreciation. Not everyone needs or wants rigorous meditation practice. Not everyone is called to monastic life or intensive spiritual discipline, but everyone can benefit from questioning assumptions about the self, from recognizing that their culture's worldview isn't the only possible way to understand existence. Alan provided this questioning, this perspective shift, this invitation to think differently, and did so with such eloquence and humor and warmth that people wanted to listen, wanted to engage, wanted to explore further. His books have sold millions of copies, been translated into dozens of languages, remained continuously in print for decades. This isn't because of clever marketing or cultural fads. It's because the books contain something valuable, something that speaks to genuine human concerns, something that helps people make sense of their lives and experiences. Academic philosophers, whose work is technically more rigorous, have far smaller audiences and far less cultural impact. Apparently, making wisdom accessible and entertaining matters more for actually helping people than maintaining scholarly purity. The meditation centers and Buddhist communities that exist across America today owe something to Alan Watts. He wasn't the only person bringing Eastern philosophy to the West. Obviously, there were many teachers, many writers, many practitioners, but he was uniquely positioned as bridge figure, as person who could speak to mainstream audiences in their own language, who could make Buddhism seem relevant and interesting, rather than exotic and foreign. Many people came to actual practice, to sitting meditation, to studying with qualified teachers, after first encountering these ideas through Alan's work. He was the entry point, the invitation, the voice that said, "This might be worth exploring," in ways that made people actually want to explore. Even his drinking and his messy personal life, even the contradictions between teaching and living, perhaps these humanize him in ways that make his teaching more accessible rather than less. If some perfect ascetic monk with no apparent struggles told you that life is suffering and the self is an illusion, you might think, that's easy for you to say, and dismiss it. But when someone clearly struggling with very human problems, someone who obviously hasn't transcended suffering, tells you these things while also acknowledging his limitations, perhaps that's more believable, more relatable, more applicable to actual lives that most of us live. Alan never pretended enlightenment was easy, or that he had achieved some final realization. He was honest about the difficulty of embodying insights intellectually understood, honest about his own failures and struggles, honest that he was working with these questions as much as anyone else, just happened to be able to articulate them clearly. The legacy, 50 years after his death, is mixed but substantial. Yes, there are critiques, valid concerns about commodification of wisdom traditions, questions about intellectual understanding versus experiential realization. But there's also this. Millions of people have encountered ideas that open their minds, that reduce their suffering, that help them live with more awareness and less anxiety. Countless individuals point to Alan Watts as the person who first introduced them to meditation. That's a meaningful contribution. Alan Watts wasn't a Zen master, but he was a brilliant translator, a gifted communicator, a person who saw that ancient wisdom could speak to modern concerns if only someone could find the right words, the right metaphors, the right tone of voice. He found those words, and the echoes of what he said continue resonating, continue helping people, continue inviting seekers to look more deeply at consciousness and existence and the mystery of being alive. The contradictions in his life don't negate the value of his teaching. They remind us that wisdom doesn't require perfection, that insight can coexist with struggle, that helping others doesn't mean you've solved all your own problems. Perhaps that's the final lesson Alan Watts offered, the teaching embedded in the gap between his words and his life. Perfection isn't required. Sincerity matters more than sainthood. And the journey of understanding, even incomplete understanding. Alan Watts showed up. He did the work. He spoke the truth as he understood it. He helped millions of people think differently about consciousness, self, and reality. He did this with humor and eloquence and remarkable consistency. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's a life that mattered, that contributed, that left the world slightly better for his having been in it. And now, these many years after his death, his voice still speaks. The ideas still invite people to question, to wonder, to look more deeply at the mystery of existence. Not bad for an entertainer who had nothing to sell. Sweet dreams, sleep seekers. May you rest well. And may the questions Alan Watts raised continue gently percolating in your mind as you drift off, not demanding answers, but simply inviting you to wonder, to remain curious, to stay open to the beautiful, strange, ultimately inexplicable fact of being alive and aware in this strange universe that somehow peoples, that somehow produces consciousness, that can look back at itself and ask, what is this? Alan Watts spent his life exploring those questions with joy and humor and profound curiosity. May we do the same, imperfectly, humanly, with all our contradictions intact. Good night.